A few years ago, a phrase exploded across the internet: quiet quitting. And depending on who you asked, it either meant workers had become lazy or they had finally learned how to set boundaries. But I've always thought the phrase itself was fascinating because most people labeled as quiet quitters weren't actually quitting. They were still showing up, still doing their jobs. They had simply stopped doing work beyond what they were hired to do. And somehow that became controversial. That made me wonder, maybe this conversation isn't actually about work ethic. Maybe it's about our expectations. So here's a personal story. I used to work in human resources. And if there's one thing HR teaches you, it's that there's often a huge difference between someone's job description and what they actually contribute. There are always employees who quietly become the backbone of a team and the person who trains every new hire, and even though it isn't in their job description, the employee everyone goes to with questions. The one who catches mistakes before they become problems. The one who stays late, who volunteers, covers shifts, answers emails after hours, keeps everything moving. For a while, those people are celebrated until something changes. They become burned out. They pull back. Or life simply demands their attention somewhere else, and suddenly everyone notices what they're no longer doing. Not because they start underperforming, but because everyone else had become accustomed to receiving more. That always fascinated me. Sometimes the issue isn't that someone lowered their effort, it's that extraordinary effort quietly became the expectation. So, from a psychology perspective, this makes perfect sense. Human beings adapt incredibly quickly. There's a concept in psychology called hedonic adaptation, and it describes how we quickly adjust to improvements until they simply become normal. The same thing happens at work. Someone consistently goes above and beyond, and eventually their exceptional effort stops feeling exceptional. It becomes the baseline. And once something becomes the baseline, losing it feels like something has been taken away, even if that person has simply returned to doing the job they were originally hired to do. But there's another psychological layer that I think is even more interesting. Many people don't just work for a paycheck, they work for identity. They become the reliable one, the fixer, the overachiever, the person everyone can count on. And when your identity becomes wrapped up in being indispensable, setting boundaries can feel surprisingly uncomfortable because reducing your workload can feel like reducing your worth. Now, I want to make an important distinction. I don't actually think giving more than you're paid for is inherently unhealthy. Some of the most successful people I know consistently create more value than they're compensated for today. They notice problems before anyone else does. They improve systems. They mentor people. They solve problems because they're genuinely invested in the work. Sometimes those people become what businesses call 10x employees. And I don't think that's a bad thing. In fact, I think there are seasons where giving more is exactly the right decision. When you're learning, building a business, trying to earn a promotion, developing expertise, investing in your future. The issue isn't whether you're giving more, the issue is why. Are you giving because you're inspired, because you're growing, because you're building something meaningful? Or are you giving because you're afraid? Afraid of disappointing people, afraid of saying no, afraid that if you stop being exceptional, people might realize you're replaceable. Those motivations lead to very different outcomes. One is an investment, the other is a survival strategy. I also don't think quiet quitting happened because people suddenly became less hardworking. I think it reflected a cultural shift. For decades, many people were taught that loyalty would naturally be rewarded. that working harder would create security, that if you kept giving, someone would eventually notice. And sometimes they did. But many people also lived through layoffs, corporate restructuring, hiring freezes, doing the work of 2 or 3 people after coworkers left, watching organizations make difficult business decisions despite years of employee loyalty. That doesn't make businesses evil, necessarily. Organizations have financial realities, but it did change the conversation. People stopped asking, how can I prove my dedication? And started asking, what does a healthy relationship with work actually look like? I think that's a much more interesting question. Because again, I don't think this is really about work at all. I think it's about identity. For so much of our lives, we're taught to measure ourselves by what we produce. The more useful we become, the more valuable we feel, the more indispensable we become, the safer we feel. But usefulness and worth are not the same thing. And if your value depends entirely on what you contribute, there will never be enough. Enough output, enough recognition, enough promotions, enough praise. Enough has a way of moving further away. And I think quiet quitting forced a lot of people to ask a question that they hadn't really considered before. Can I care deeply about my work without making it my identity? Can I contribute meaningfully without sacrificing myself? Can I be ambitious without believing my worth depends on my productivity? Those aren't workplace questions, they're human questions. And I also think it's okay for our relationship with work to have seasons. There will be seasons where you naturally give more. You're learning, you're building, you're excited, you're chasing a dream. You're supporting your team through a difficult season. Giving more during those times isn't failure. It can be deeply meaningful. But there will also be seasons where life asks more of you than work does. A newborn, a sick parent, burnout, grief, a health challenge. And in those seasons, doing exactly what your job requires is enough. Not because you've become lazy, but because your energy is finite. So I don't think the goal is quiet quitting. And I don't think the goal is becoming someone who endlessly overextends themselves either. I think the goal is something much harder: to work with integrity, to contribute generously, to know when you're investing and when you're simply proving something, because those are not the same thing. Work should enrich your life, not become your entire identity. And maybe that's the real lesson hidden inside the phrase quiet quitting. Quiet quitting. It wasn't a movement about doing less. It was an invitation to redefine enough, to remember that boundaries and ambition can coexist, and that a sustainable career isn't built by giving everything. It's built by knowing which season you're in.